This is Dorie Clark, and we are here for our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better. I am here today with journalist Jon Gertner. He is the author of the book, The Ice at the End of the World, and also The Idea Factory. And today we are going to be talking about how to create a culture of innovation. Jon, so glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Dorie. It's great to be here.
Excellent. And welcome to everyone who is tuning in. We're so glad to have you. Please feel free to type into the chat box who you are, where you are tuning in from, and also throughout the course of our interview, any questions that you have for Jon. So, Jon, the first thing that's on my mind when we think about creating a culture of innovation is we have just been through this crazy experience of the pandemic. And I know that you recently wrote an in-depth magazine feature talking about some of the innovations that have actually come out of the pandemic in the world of genomics. And it sounds like there's actually some incredible things that have been dramatically accelerated because of COVID. Can you tell us what you discovered and kind of what's on the horizon, what awaits us?
Sure. I mean, like a lot of journalists, I had a pretty strange pandemic in the sense of, okay, how do you do journalism without actually, getting on a plane every couple of months and sort of interviewing everybody in person? So actually, I worked on two stories, and one was, as you said, about DNA sequencing, which became which, as most of us know, is a kind of vital technology for all sorts of things, medical uses, testing, finding, relics of ancient history and bones and ancestry. But it became really, really important in sort of tracking the variations of the virus as it mutated. And for me, I think, as we can talk about Bell Labs in a second, I think it was a good example of how innovation and innovative thinking really comes out of good problems sometimes rather than good ideas. At least that was the way a lot of people at Bell Labs saw it. And the problem with a virus that mutates fairly regularly and creates these variants that are trying to escape vaccines, for instance, or trying to sort of, definitely increase their spread to the unvaccinated or to the vulnerable. Presented a very, very useful problem for people who want to use DNA sequencing to sort of understand how the virus was mutating. And so that story was really about a lot of this vital work that was done all over the world, not only just to sequence different strains of the virus, but also to create these vast online databases so they could kind of archive them in a kind of massive global bioinformatics sort of revolution. And I think what's crucial probably to note is this was the first pandemic that we really ever used, I think, DNA sequencing to sort of, use its utility and apply it towards solutions, not just towards formulating a vaccine based on the DNA sequence of the virus, but also tracking how it was evolving into things, unfortunately, like the Delta variant, which we now have. It's not necessarily a good news story. As we know, the pandemic is still raging all over the world, and we have a resurgence in the US. But that was a kind of innovative technology that did not take a rest during the pandemic. It was really the opposite, where it really stepped up.
That's really interesting, Jon. Thank you so much. And we have some great viewers tuning in. We have Lisa from Atlanta. We have Cheryl from Minneapolis. We have another LinkedIn user from Germany and many more tuning in. So again, please feel free to type into the chat box. Let us know who you are and where you're tuning in from, and any questions that you have about the world of science and innovation for journalist Jon Gertner. We're excited to talk about that. Now, Jon, a couple of technologies that you alluded to in your recent coverage around innovation during the pandemic that I thought sounded kind of fascinating. One of them was the development around a sensor, I guess, that can potentially be attached to a smartphone that can literally sniff pathogens out of the air. And the other one was a blood test that it sounds like this is actually pretty close to operability, that can detect 50 different kinds of cancers with a simple blood test. Can you talk a little bit more about those things? Because it sounds a little bit like science fiction, but perhaps we're closer than we think.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff coming out of this idea, how would I put it? DNA sequencing really began, I'd say, if we go back 20 years ago to when the human genome was mapped. And to do that required billions of dollars and vast resources. And I think it's like a classic innovation story in that, how do we make this cheaper and better? And what happened was there were a lot of private companies. There was a fair amount of government grants and money to try and make, if not bets, but to sort of spur some of the innovative processes that would have been, I think, too risky otherwise, because there wasn't really a market for machines that could kind of read DNA sequences yet. And over the last 15, I'd say between 2000 and 2015, we saw this kind of vast increase in computing power, as well as these sort of evolution of technologies that could, use blood samples or cells to look at and map DNA sequences, to the point where we really have, there are really a few companies that kind of control this technology today. And that would be Illumina in the United States, Pacific Biosciences is another, and there's one in England called Oxford Nanopore, and in China there are several others as well. But beyond just creating a kind of cheaper and better way to read our genome or to do a genomic test, they can also do samples of cells now that look really kind of in depth or in a deeper depth into, for instance, as you mentioned, cancer cells or detection and that kind of thing. So I wouldn't say we're there yet, but this is on the cusp where these are technologies or tests or kits that are being tested. They will be used on the same kinds of machines that have been developed over the course of 20 years. And yeah, they could certainly be revolutionary. Now, imagine going to the doctor and your blood test is not just for lipids, for instance, and all sorts of other things, but also they run a screen whereby you kind of get a very, very early warning that you might have a certain kind of cancer that's very, very treatable in a very early stage. And that could be very revolutionary. It could create some unforeseen complications too. Is our health system ready for that kind of thing? What do you do with an early stage diagnosis? I mean, that would kind of, suggest a brave new world that we're not maybe ready for socially or economically, even if our technology is there already. But yeah, those are the kinds of things that that DNA sequencing, I think, portends. Whether it happens in 5 years or 15 years, I'm not really sure what the time frame will be, but I think this is what a lot of people in the field are looking at as the next big thing. The other thing you mentioned about sensors, DNA sequencers have gotten smaller and smaller to the point where there's one that's sold by this company, Oxford Nanopore, that's really smaller than an iPhone. And you can actually hook it up to an iPhone and it can, take a biological sample and read it. So, having a kind of airborne sensor that might tie into your iPhone is really not in the realm of science fiction. And what if you walk into a room and it detects a pathogen or an allergen? And again, we're not there yet, but these are things that have, great potential and viability. Whether they'll be affordable, that's another question. Again, innovation kind of goes along with something that is better but cheaper too. So can we make it so that it will actually scale? That's a complicated question.
I love this conversation. Thank you very much, Jon Gertner. And it certainly resonates with me. One of my books, Stand Out, How to Find Your Breakthrough Idea and Build a Following Around It. In it, I profiled Eric Schott, who is an expert in genomics. He is at Mount Sinai. And we talked a lot. He was one of the pioneers of using big data in medicine. So there's so far that the field has developed since even 2015 when the book came out and he was profiled. So it's great to hear about some of these advances. Now, a question that I have for you, when the casual observer thinks about or talks about innovation, if you say that to the average American, they're probably going to say, oh, innovation, Elon Musk. That's kind of the vision that comes to most people. I'm curious, do you have a perspective about Elon Musk and about the work that he's doing at Tesla and his various enterprises, SpaceX? Is he a latter-day Thomas Edison, or is that not really the most apt metaphor?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've written about Tesla in the past a couple times, right before the Model S came out, and also again more recently for the New York Times Magazine when Tesla was trying to improve its self-driving capabilities for its cars. I mean, he's done something absolutely remarkable. I mean, he's built two companies that, against all odds, have really succeeded. And I think Tesla really did revolutionize the automobile industry, not just in the United States, but around the world. And it made us understand not only that electric cars are viable, but they are imminent, and that they're the future, and that they are maybe not just viable, but necessary. Thomas Edison, I've studied Thomas Edison too, because I spend a lot of time looking at history and the history of innovation. I'm not really sure if that's quite fitting. I mean, I think what Elon Musk has done is certainly followed very particular breakthrough ideas. For certain, with SpaceX, it was the idea of reusable rockets and changing the economics of space flight. So from one big idea came, a multitude of different projects that really, I think, have changed the notion of how a private company can really alter the future of space exploration. And with Tesla, I think we see a certain similarity that if there was one really big idea, was that lithium-ion batteries, changed the equation for changed the possibility for electric cars. Because, we've had this idea of electric cars for many, many decades, but it was really hobbled by a really heavy, kind of unworkable technology of different kinds of batteries. So this notion of using lithium-ion batteries, managing their heat and doing it in a very kind of innovative way, hiring really great people, and really just, having the kind of incredible drive to sort of see these companies through. So, I mean, there's a lot of controversy that surrounds Elon Musk, for sure. It's certainly fascinating to watch his work, but I think it's worth sort of also acknowledging that, he's really kind of changed the face of industry. And he does truly sort of show that, I think, notions of what is impossible in industry are in fact possible. And for that, whether we call him a great inventor, I would probably shy away from that. We could talk about what innovation is and isn't, but certainly his companies have used immensely important innovative ideas to sort of move both of their respective industries by leaps and bounds forward.
That's really interesting. Thank you. If you're enjoying this conversation, you can learn more about journalist and author Jon Gertner at his website, jongertner.net. We are talking about how to create a culture of innovation. And of course, this is our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better. If you want to make sure you never miss an episode, you can follow me by subscribing to my LinkedIn newsletter. You can do it at dorieclark.com/li. Hit the subscribe button, and you will get weekly reminders about our great show and guests with fascinating perspectives. So, Jon, we had a really interesting question come through that I want to tackle from Allison. She says, what are your thoughts around a solution for the doubt or concerns that many unvaccinated folks have about the RNA science that was used for the current vaccines? There's a second part of the question that maybe we can turn to a little bit later, because I feel like that's a meaty enough one there. But vaccine hesitancy is a real issue these days, as President Biden's trying to get us up over the 70% vaccinated threshold. What are your thoughts about unvaccinated folks who have concerns?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And my first instinct is to sort of like think, oh gosh, that I am the wrong person to answer that question. Not because I'm not, I am vaccinated. I'm a great believer in sort of the breakthrough here, but that I'm sympathetic that some people are frightened by new technology. I wish I could say that I had sort of a one-size-fits-all solution. And that might, in fact, be my answer, that I'm not sure there really is. I mean, different people have all sorts of different reasons for hesitancy for vaccines, at least as far as I understand it. It seems that we've solved the access problem in the United States, thank goodness. We haven't solved it abroad. We have to. But the idea that that these are safe, I think we really know now. I mean, it perhaps becomes a question of outreach and communication. I think some people will prove to be unreachable. They are hesitant. They are fearful. There's probably no getting around it, for the same reason that they probably don't want to get a flu shot and might not even have a kind of deep-seated belief that there's something untrustworthy about vaccines. and I don't know how to get past sort of that kind of philosophical divide. However, for people who are open to that kind of communication, I think there are a lot of, good inroads towards sort of showing examples of community. I think yesterday at the White House, we just had a sort of young influencer sort of show that, hey, these are safe, these are important, you should get vaccinated. I think what we also know now is really just a question of evidence that especially with the RNA vaccines, we know that there's almost no side effects. And here we are going on, almost 8 months after they've been introduced. And that's, just incredibly important, I think, in terms of sort of reassuring people. But again, we're talking about human nature. We're not talking about technology, I think. And it's a whole different question. It's a really important question. It's like a user experience question in some ways.
Yeah, that's really true. I wanted to take a moment to greet some of the terrific viewers who are tuning in. We have Boris from Luxembourg. We have Sakchai tuning in. We have Helga from Finland. We have a LinkedIn user from Virginia who's joining us. Oh, Sakchai's tuning in from Thailand. That's wonderful. We have Mary from Indiana and many more. Jenny from New York. We're so glad that you all are here. Please feel free to ask your questions to Jon Gertner in the chat box. We're eager to hear what is on your mind. And if you're enjoying the conversation, hit the like and share button so that your friends can benefit from it as well. Now, Jon, you are the author of a book called The Idea Factory, which is a history of Bell Labs. And I am curious, I'd love to sort of hear your perspective about this. Certainly, we can learn a lot about innovation today and in the future by studying what it looked like in the past. Why was Bell Labs so central? And what is it that more people need to understand about its contribution to innovation in general?
Yeah, if we look at really, I guess what we could call these sort of foundational technologies of the 20th century. So these are all the technologies upon which the technologies of today are built. We have to kind of go back to places like Bell Labs, which was the great laboratory of the 20th century. And what came out of Bell Labs was the transistor, which is really the building block for all electronic devices in the world. Nothing runs without them. Computers, cars, anything you name has billions or millions, at least, of transistors within it, probably billions. The theory of the laser came out of Bell Labs. Think of all the laser surgery or all laser communications that are essential for sort of fiber optics. The idea of cellular networks came out of Bell Labs. The idea of communication satellites came out of Bell Labs. The idea of information theory, how we send information by sort of, ones and zeros and these kinds of manage these sort of immense kind of digital exchanges, all that came out of Bell Labs. So for me, the question of Bell Labs is sort of, okay, well, all this stuff arose from this one place at this one point in time, which was really between 1945 and 1975. And this includes the Unix operating system. It includes the C+ computer language. So it was really a incredible place, a kind of Shangri-La of technology. And why was it? Was it culture? Was it just a lot of smart people in one place? Can you unlock the mysteries of this place that sort of help us understand? So for me, I think that's the question of why Bell Labs matters. If we want to understand where technology comes from and how a place could not just come up with one important technology, but one after another, after another, after another. And that's a very different thing. So I think what we can ascribe to them is that they had, if not a formula, they had a method. They had something special to be able to reproduce those kinds of breakthrough ideas over and over again. And what was it? I can tell you, but you can, I'm not sure what the next question is, but I don't want to anticipate.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you. And I see that what you're saying is touching a chord here. Allison says, "Blast from the past. I was so shook up when Bell was broken up." So so clearly it has resonated with a lot of people. But so I certainly want to follow up on your tantalizing clue that you have dropped. If a company today, Jon, wanted to learn from Bell Labs and from their example, if they say, yes, we want to be more innovative, we want to create that kind of culture, what is it that they should be doing? What are some of the key lessons that a company today can learn from the past?
Right. Well, it's probably worth saying that Bell Labs was the laboratory, the R&D laboratory of the big phone company, the monopolistic phone company at that era in time, which was AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph. It was a different AT&T from the AT&T today. So it had a lot of money. It had a lot of money and a lot of people, and it had a lot of really smart people. It had the best people you could find. So there's that. And that mattered, but I don't know if that certainly wasn't everything. I think one thing that I think is important and worth noting is that innovation isn't just a matter of getting a lot of smart people together and paying them a lot of money. It's also a question of culture. And culture doesn't necessarily cost anything to change or to improve or to alter or to implement. I mean, it could cost something, but not necessarily a lot. So, there were a lot of things about Bell Labs that I think were kind of key to how it worked. I mean, one was a lot of smart people, but I think, there was this kind of sense early on that it was important to understand that the innovation was not just a matter of coming up with a new idea. Early on, I had alluded to sort of the notion of problems, a problem-focused office rather than an idea-focused office. That there were tons of ideas out there, almost too many ideas. Everybody had tons of ideas, but the question of finding a good problem was really vital in the Bell Labs culture. And because this was the phone company that was really a kind of early stage technology, there were tons of problems. Actually creating this kind of global network for communication, we're still struggling with it, but at the time, those problems were monumental. So they kind of filtered down to the scientists and engineers at Bell Labs and created a culture of problem solving that I think was essential, not necessarily always a culture of ideas. Beyond that, there was a kind of sense that you didn't necessarily want to solve a problem by putting like-minded people together. You didn't want to get all the physicists in the room. This was an early on it might sound obvious today, but early on it was kind of breakthrough that new ideas and new solutions really came from the kind of interface and sometimes even the friction between different people coming at problems differently. So that was one thing. Another thing was sort of creating a kind of, I think, physical culture of innovation and idea exchange. There's this talk now, or a lot of discussion now of, should we all keep working from home? Should we go back to the office? Are open offices really innovative? Do they create like these serendipitous encounters? And I think, people watching who sort of think about this thing it's heavy on their minds. So, Bell Labs was pretty early on in that you really want to get people together. And I think this idea of an open office wasn't really applicable to Bell Labs. There was something, I think, akin to sort of get everybody together, make them bounce off each other in the hallways, in the lunchroom, but also give them an office and a place or a laboratory where they could go to pursue their own ideas. And also always leave your door open. It was a culture of open doors. It was a culture where not only was anyone allowed to go to anyone else's office and visit and interrupt if they needed to, but a place where I think knowledge transfer was seen as essential. Whether you were the most esteemed scientist at Bell Labs, and there were even Nobel laureates on staff, you were never to refuse any younger person who came to your office with a question. And I think that was crucial too, that kind of knowledge transfer. So good problems, people who didn't necessarily think alike, an architecture and culture of kind of idea exchange and problem solving, a place for knowledge transfer. I think that one thing that's really crucial is this idea too at Bell Labs that failure was acceptable. That if you were working on the outer edge of what was new, of what could be done, you were going to fail sometimes. Maybe you're going to fail a lot of times. But out of failure should come some understanding of how to succeed next time. So that was, I think, crucial, especially for the scientists in research, that if you weren't failing sometimes, and this sounds obvious now because the fast fail sort of culture has sort of arisen in Silicon Valley, but it was kind of revolutionary, I think, at the time in the 40s and 50s. And I think if there's a final thing to the culture of Bell Labs that I think it's important is that as much as some of the things that came out of there were ideas like digital information or information theory, or here's how you could kind of create a cellular network without necessarily going forward and building one, it was the notion that if you had a really good solution to a problem, it could be implemented and it could have impact. And you could take even the scientists or the mathematicians working in the sort of farthest reaches of theory at Bell Labs. But a lot of them, as I found when interviewing them, took immense pride in the fact that some of their ideas really did get implemented into communication systems. They saved money, they made communication possible or easier. It mattered. It mattered in terms of inspiring the people who were working there, and it mattered in terms of getting them to kind of continue to kind of contribute to that culture. So I think if I could, there's probably some other things, but I think those are the big ones that come to mind.
Those are very helpful ones. Thank you. And
Sure.
Jon, we have a follow-up question from one of our viewers tuning in from LinkedIn who wanted to know about the role of money. This viewer says, from my understanding, the US has a well-established venture capital culture, and this helps your economy to bring innovations to market. Would you say that available budget and capital is key for an innovative culture? What is your perspective on that?
It's a great question. I think I would look at it differently. That venture capital or grants or startup funding, are essential, certainly, to bring a new company and innovations, to scale them up and to have impact. Which I think, if we define innovation not just as a new idea, but an idea or a new product or process that has scale and impact, which I think is a useful way to define it. I think we're talking, money is necessary. We need capitalization to do it. And, for some industries, like whether it's code or an app, it's not a lot. If it's something like SpaceX or a new car company, it's tremendous. The infrastructure involved in building something like that is huge. So yeah, does money create culture? Money can sometimes undermine culture. It's kind of, I think, up to the founders, up to the managers to, I think, manage the culture. And I don't think necessarily good funding or venture funding is an assurance that the culture of innovation will sort of continue. I've seen different experiences. I don't think necessarily that we can say, big companies have a bad culture of innovation because they're big and dumb and slow, and small companies are nimble. I think that's a very kind of simplistic way of thinking about it. I think, I've seen all types. Money helps because it reduces stress. Money helps because it allows you to hire good people who can inspire others, who can come in with new ideas, who can solve problems that you might not have been able to solve otherwise. But money doesn't assure that the culture will work.
Yeah, that's an important point to raise. Thank you. We've been talking with Jon Gertner. He is a journalist and the author of The Ice at the End of the World and the book, The Idea Factory. We've been talking about how to create a culture of innovation. We are having our weekly Newsweek interview show. Better if you want to always tune in and see cats. It's an unexpected but welcome development when there is a cat. So you get extra bonus points when that happens. Mark a check mark for yes. You can follow me at DorieClark.com. Sign up for weekly updates. Jon, we probably have time for one more question, and a great one came through from Shiva, who wanted to know a little bit more about the culture of innovation in the U.S. versus outside. She wants to know, what do you think about the culture of innovation and entrepreneurship in the U.S.? Do you think that the U.S. might emphasize the individual hero more than team efforts, or is it all based on company culture? What's your quick take on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's sort of moving in that direction, isn't it? I think you see a kind of bias, especially on the part of VCs, to kind of fund that kind of hero entrepreneur repeatedly. But people with track records certainly have a kind of ability to sort of bring returns or financial returns over and over again. They have a better sort of rate of return or better odds. So, the U.S. versus other countries, I'd say it's different. We've certainly evolved into a more kind of VC-oriented sort of startup culture. But also we have this kind of rich ecosystem of universities that I think, do a tremendous job of sort of seeding these ideas, whether it's MIT or Stanford, or I was just up at University of Michigan seeing some really interesting stuff on like infrastructure and engineering. And I think, I think what might still differentiate the U.S., and I think it's true elsewhere, is there is a culture of risk taking that I don't necessarily see as much elsewhere. But I can't speak as an expert on Asia, for instance. But sometimes what you get with, I think, these startup founders is a more of a willingness, I think, to take risks and to fail than you might see elsewhere.
Amazing. We have been talking about creating a culture of innovation. Our guest has been Jon Gertner. And thank you all for tuning in to Newsweek Better. Jon, thank you for being our guest this week.
Oh, thank you so much, Dorie. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you next week.